Good morning again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our penultimate summer Saturday for 2020. Today, we're focusing on garden, and I'm really excited that I am joined by our staff horticulturist, Ryan Dostal, but we also have a special guest today. We are joined as well by Joel Fry of Bartram's Garden, who's going to be telling us a little bit about what Bartram's Garden is, and he's also going to join us in discussing seed saving, what Ryan is going to be running, and he's going to tell us about some really amazing 18th century seed packets that were found just down the street from Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia. Without further ado, if you wish to participate in our first activity this morning, we're going to have a little bit of an introduction to what we're doing, why we're doing it. But then Ryan is going to do a demonstration, and if you wish to follow along, you might like to have the supplies in the red circle on hand. So we'll give everybody just a moment to get settled with that, and then we'll get started with our first activity. All right, Ryan, you ready to get started?
Yeah, sure.
Here we go.
Well, we're pretty excited. In just a second, Joel's going to tell us a little bit more about Bartram's Garden. But seed saving is a very important process, and we're going to be looking at it in a little bit more detail. My goals are to give everyone the basics, and there's quite a bit there. And I really hope that I can maybe inspire some folks to begin the practice of seed saving and maybe provide a few tips to those folks who might already be doing it. But for the unindoctrinated, seed saving is just that way that we take seeds from one year's crop and then process them, handle them in an appropriate way so that they're ready to go the next year. Now, what's really awesome about this program is George Mason actually visits Bartram's Garden while attending the Constitutional Convention, and that's why we wanted to get Joel in on this, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about Bartram's Garden now, both the historic site and the modern one.
So thank you, Ryan. I'm going to share my screen and do a short presentation. So just a second while that gets set up. So yeah, I work at Bartram's Garden. It's a city park in Philadelphia. Sure.
There we go. Perfect. All right, go for it.
Okay. So Bartram's Garden is a city park in Philadelphia. Actually, the grounds are open, free to the public, dawn to dusk. It's been preserved since the 1890s. It's the home of the Bartram family, and most people in the U.S. maybe have heard of the Bartrams, maybe not, but if they have, they've probably only heard of one of them. It's actually 3 generations of a family. John Bartram is the one who first begins traveling and founds a botanic garden. His son William is probably the Bartram that actually met George Mason in 1787, and you'll hear more about that. John Bartram designed and built his own house, which you see there on the right, and his son William Bartram is equally famous and was quite a plant illustrator. So on the left you see a very fine ink drawing of the purple pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea, that was engraved as the frontispiece for the first textbook on botany in North America. The park is about 46 acres. It's got about a mile of riverfront trail on either side. We have an urban farm, Sankofa Farm, that specializes in African diaspora crops, run by Chris and Ty. We sell seeds. Actually, if you go to our website, we sell seeds collected from our own garden, and also Owen Taylor's True Love seeds, which Ryan might also say a word about later. So visit our website. We don't have a lot of information about what the garden looked like in the 18th century, but we do have this one image on the left. It's an ink drawing done by the young son, William Bartram, when he was probably 14 years old. And on the right is a modern plan view of the historic botanic garden. It's quite large, between 8 and 10 acres, perhaps. We only interpret small bits of it because of our limited staff, but you see something about the layout in the areas based on a National Park Service plan that was done in 2002. We don't know what John Bartram looked like. There are no surviving portraits. So we use this imaginary portrait by the Brandywine Valley artist Howard Pyle of the late 19th century. On the right is John Bartram's close friend, Peter Collinson. Bartram and Collinson are both Quakers of a similar age. They never meet, but they wind up corresponding sometimes every week. They write a letter back and forth between the 1730s and the 1760s. And this engraved portrait of Collinson after his death in a short biography has some Bartram plants around it. You may recognize the plant on the lower right. That's the North American rhododendron, Rhododendron maxim. And on the left is Sonia canadense, which Linnaeus names. That's a Pennsylvania native plant that Bartram sent to Peter Collinson, and one of John Bartram's medicinal plants. So I wanted to give you just an idea of what Bartram began doing. He began traveling widely, beginning in the 1730s, and this is just one of a series of 5 maps that were put together a while back of Bartram's travels. But the line you see in red is a very long trip he took in 1738 when he went through Maryland and down the Chesapeake Bay and then to Fredericksburg and then down to Williamsburg. He was trying to meet John Clayton, but missed him because Clayton was away. Spent some time in Williamsburg and then went up to James River. So he met William Byrd and Bishop Randolph and John Randolph and perhaps Peter Jefferson, and then went all the way up along the edge of the Blue Ridge and into the Shenandoah and then back to Philadelphia, all in about a month's time. So that's his first introduction to Virginia. One thing we know for sure, so Bartram made pressed plant specimens, which he sends to England. And in the specimens sent to Lord Peter, there is this flattened plant you see on the left. I brought the berries of this pretty plant from Virginia, and we know that's fall 1738. And that plant is the scarlet honeysuckle, trumpet honeysuckle, Anicera sempervirens, which we still grow at Bartram's garden today.
And we've got that here at Gunston Hall too, in our courtyard and around our visitor center, all over the place.
It's a beautiful plant. It does very well in Philadelphia now, and always brings hummingbirds, which is something I like about it.
That was about what I was about to say. We get so many more hummingbirds now.
So Bartram began making long lists of plants as he collected them and sending the seeds, particularly seeds, to Europe. And Collinson organized that as a business. So from about 1740 until John Bartram's death, yearly he sent large shipments of these boxes of seeds. And we happen to have his or other copies of his catalogs for a number of these yearly shipments, maybe about 7 or 8 of them we have. So on the left, here's a 1757 list of 105 varieties. On the right, a printed magazine transcription of one of his lists of 100 varieties. So if you had the funds, if you had 5 guineas, you could buy a box of Bartram seeds. Most people think of this as something small, but these were enormous boxes. So we made facsimiles, and these big boxes you see here, these big rectangular boxes, roughly 3 feet by 2.5 feet by 2 feet, are what you got for your 5 guineas. And 5 guineas is 5 pounds and 5 shillings. So that comes out that if the boxes were filled with 105 varieties, you paid a shilling for each. That sounds like very small money to us in the modern world, but it might have been as much as $1,000 if you calculated the value in our modern money. So it was only the very wealthy who could afford Bartram seeds. And that remains a thing of their business through all 3 generations. John Bartram's son, William Bartram, we do have a portrait of, painted in 1808 by Charles Wilson Peale. William began traveling with his father when he was probably only 10 or 11. He went to New England, he went to the Catskill Mountains, down to Virginia and North Carolina several times. And then in 1773-76, William Bartram travels on his own, funded by a London physician. And you can see on this outline where he went to Florida, up to the Cherokee country, across through the Creek Nation down to Mobile, to Pensacola, and then all the way to the Mississippi River, roughly at Baton Rouge at Point Coupé. William Bartram's extensive travels, he wrote up into a book that gets published in Philadelphia in 1791, his travels through North and South Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. This book is still widely read today and many editions available. And then George Mason visits with his son, July 1787, early morning, July 14th, 1787, with James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and a bunch of other, mostly North Carolina and South Carolina members of the convention. A New England reverend was recording this whole trip, and he says, "We found him and another man. Him is probably William Bartram, hoeing in his garden in a short jacket and trousers without shoes or stockings. He at first stared at us and seemed to be somewhat embarrassed at seeing so large and gay a company so early in the morning. Dr. Clarkson, a Philadelphia physician, was the only person he knew." So this group of 2 carriages of about 20 people showed up really at dawn, where the Bartram brothers are out just doing their weekend work, had no idea they were going to show up. And they probably spent a couple hours there. Third generation, a granddaughter of John Bartram, continues on the business. She's much less known, but we have a lot of information about the garden in that period because they published catalogs. So Anne Bartram Carr and her husband, Robert Carr, ran the garden from 1810 to 1815. And Robert Carr was originally a printer trained in the Franklin family at Franklin Court. And then just briefly, I want to mention that we've done quite a bit of garden archaeology, just like Gunston Hall. And just about 4 years ago, we restored an important garden from that third generation, from the Anne Carr period. We call it the Anne Bartram Carr Garden. It's on the back side, or what was originally the back of the Bartram house. And we had a lot of information based on photographs of the late 19th century, on earlier plans, and on archaeology. And so this dark red set of paths are the paths that were gone that we recreated. And on the right, you'll see some little areas. These are archaeological units where we found traces of either the path or the geometry. Mostly we found the trenches that the boxwood edgings had been planted in because they were deeply dug and had been replanted several times. So in 2016, in the spring, we removed lots of trees that had been on this area and laid out an entirely new herbaceous plant garden. And you see here the boxwood edging going in the spring. We had trouble with them, half of them probably dying that winter, but we replaced them. And then here's the next year. It's almost like an instant garden, which has been extremely successful at Bartram. So that's my brief introduction, and you'll hear more as we go on. And I guess I'll switch over to Ryan now.
Yeah, Joel, that's really fascinating. Real quick though, before I kind of get into things, I'm wondering what were some of the things that were sent in those seed boxes, and did the folks that were receiving them expect them to do well? I mean, it seems kind of challenging.
Yeah, so it's an interesting business. It's usually sort of titled nobility, lords, dukes, earls, even the Prince of Wales ordered these boxes. They have large estates with professional garden staff. So mostly they probably handed them over to their garden staff and forgot about them, perhaps. What John Bartram is sending is pretty much all the woody plants of Eastern North America. So it's almost always woody plants, trees and shrubs, some common things like oaks and tulip trees, but then some rare things like rhododendrons and azaleas and even more, rare things. A lot of these seeds require several years in the ground to germinate, to break dormancy, which they may not have known. Mostly what they would do is they would bed them out in beds and just wait and hope something would come up. And the most prized plant that everyone wanted was a magnolia, any kind of magnolia. And at one point, Collinson writes in a letter that includes some magnolia seeds in every box, because just that name will sell an entire 5-guinea box of seeds. So if they got one magnolia, they were happy. Probably almost certainly they got some things like tulip trees, some oaks, maybe a dogwood, a cornice. But yeah, it was really a trial and error, or a pine tree. And certain people wanted one thing. So certain collectors only wanted evergreens. And then eventually the London nursery trade gets into it. So they begin ordering boxes from Collinson. And they're probably really the most successful because they are professionals. And then they grow on the plants and sell them at really high inflated prices once they have a small sapling, like a 2 or 3 foot plant.
Gosh, that's just amazing. And it was kind of shocking to get the idea or wrap my brain around the fact that they're not really exchanging vegetable crops, which is kind of what I'm most fascinated in. So I'm going to share screen really quick and kind of get us into the topic of seed saving. Let me fire this up. And I guess the first big idea that I want to share and kind of bring out is this multi-directional flow of seeds. And Joel's kind of talking about how seeds are going from the Americas to Europe. But we know seeds are moving really everywhere across the Atlantic world. And this ad here shows us that. Oh, got the wrong way, pardon. So this ad gives us a sense of that. And most of the crops that came in this shipment were actually vegetables, garden vegetables. And so there's this just tremendous amount of diversity that's being brought into the New World, into the colonies and Virginia. And what's interesting is as we kind of piece this together, it's pretty challenging. This little bit here kind of gives us some of that cheeky flavor of the Herbals books written about gardening in this time period. But what's interesting is just this idea that everyone is aware of these things. It's a very universal part of the experience, and seed saving for that matter is certainly neglected. And it's really interesting sometimes even what they don't say. And we'll kind of be delving into that a little bit. As I think about this as well, there's two kinds of things to kind of keep in mind. There's sort of a high road, and that's the statesmen, the Washingtons and Jefferson, and they're really trying to build a successful agricultural economy. And so you'll read Jefferson, he's traveling in New England, and he'll write about sugar maples and how this could be this awesome crop to replace tobacco. Washington and George Mason even will get involved in growing wheat. And Washington writes of trying to take care of the Hessian fly, which is just thwarting wheat growers across the Atlantic seaboard. And so that's kind of the high road. They want to be economically successful as a new nation, whereas other individuals, tenant farmers, indentured servants from England, enslaved Africans, these folks are working sort of on a lower road, more decentralized, but certainly making really valuable choices and contributing to the seed saving. And those three groups, in addition to indigenous peoples, are really the folks that are saving seeds on the Mason Neck. And movement is a big idea here as well. All of these different groups are moving about in this time period. And it's really important to understand how that will impact what you're growing and where you're growing it. Because if you have seed from England and you bring it here, it's going to handle it a little bit differently. And that's sort of what people are working with and sorting out. So what we're going to do now is just talk a little bit about some of the varieties that these different communities worked with. And this is an imperfect way to think about seed saving. It gives us some of the choices that they were making as they were selecting different seeds. And then we'll get a little bit more into the details of what we know that they were doing as they were saving seeds. So Native peoples were largely in the Mason Neck area, had been displaced at this time period. The Dogu were driven out by George Mason's folks and preceding generations, but a lot of their crops had stayed. And we know that the natives had developed a number of different corn varieties, 7 actually. So flint, dent, flour, waxy, popcorn, sweet corn. And all of these varieties had different cultivars. And so they were doing really high level seed saving with their corn crops. And a lot of these had become staples for the Europeans and the enslaved Africans that will follow after them in this area.
Hey, Ryan, we have a quick question.
Sure.
High level. Popular plants that come from the Americas and go to Europe. We know obviously potatoes, corn, tomatoes, pumpkins, squashes, magnolias. Any other big categories that you can think of off the top of your head?
Those are some of the biggest ones.
Peppers as well.
Oh,
Peppers,
that's
sweet
right.
peppers.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to see some peppers that came from the Americas in just a few minutes.
Yeah, actually, we're 2 slides out. I'll have to think more on that, but those are, I think, really the most important ones. Corn and potato are just tremendously important because of the amount of calories they can produce on small acreages. And so they were really picked up quickly by the peasant class in Europe. So one thing that's interesting to note when we're talking about enslaved Africans who are saving seeds, and they kept quite large gardens in Virginia, perhaps as large as half an acre, maybe larger in certain areas. They all came here with very diverse agricultural backgrounds. And so we can see, there's folks that had pastoral experience, folks that were growing grain. Rice cultivation was an important part of some of their agricultural systems. And then other groups were familiar with growing tuber roots, and that was their main staple. Now, not all of those crops were successfully transplanted, and that kind of is why crops like sweet potato became so important. And from the varieties that we have today, we have the sense that they're selecting things that are really resilient and productive. And that bird pepper there is one that Lacey mentioned. It comes out of the Caribbean and up north, traveling with the transatlantic slave trade, and is being grown in Virginia and other colonies. But then there's also it's called collared eggplant, and this is just fascinating. And that is a variety that True Love carries, that seed company I mentioned earlier. This eggplant, you can eat the greens and you can eat the eggplant. And so that sort of multi-use feature it seems to be very useful if you're a community trying to secure and stabilize your food supply. Now, Europeans are trying to recreate their systems from home here on the Atlantic seaboard. And in large part, they're successful in some ways. But when it comes to the foodways, their diets are very different. We know that they're eating a lot more corn than their English counterparts. And I have here this sort of fascinating bit highlighted. This is talking about pumpkins. And it says in England, they're cultivated only as a curiosity. Few people relish them here. But in the New World, in Virginia and the other colonies, a lot of folks are using them, and they are a staple food. Also, Europeans loved salad. It didn't grow so well here, so they become to rely on cabbage more. Did you have a question, Lacey?
Oh, I was thinking about pumpkins, and when I look through 18th century cookbooks, and 17th century cookbooks, there are very few pumpkin recipes. There are some. Squashes are much more popular, and you'll see them for winter squash, although they don't necessarily indicate what the squash type was. So it could have been pumpkins, but typically when they're talking about squash, they're thinking about things like acorn and butternut and some of those other squashes.
And I think that's interesting too, because it's sort of a slow process for some of these crops to be adopted in some places, taking decades. And so something to get really popular, it might not show up in the cookbook for a while, even though folks had been eating it. And so the big idea here with all of this is that there's this tremendous diversity available to folks in 18th century colonies, America, and this is a result of all of the exchanges that are going on between America, Africa, and Europe, as well as beyond. And seed savers are sustaining that diversity, and they're actually building on it as they work towards acclimating the crops that they have to the specific places that they are growing them. And now we're going to jump in just a little bit with some seed saving. We weren't able to acquire any proper beans or peas or lettuce, but we do have some things that are very similar. It's just not the right time of year, and our garden's been a little bit slow in getting going. But the idea being that starting with self-pollinators is really easy because all the things you need there are in that small flower. It is fertile and it will produce seed quite readily. So I'm gonna
Ryan, by including the peas, the beans, and the lettuce, these are easy ones that you can have at home. Mm-hmm. Some of the ones that we're going to be using today are a little bit harder to get started initially, but these start really well, grow really well, and you can expand from there. We just recommend starting with these.
Yeah, that's exactly true. So I'm going to cut this down here and head over so we can see some of the visual here. And I have also just quick, this is what we'll be working with, false indigo. So I'm going to head over there now, and I'll see you guys in just a second.
And maybe while Ryan's getting set up, I'll just mention beans are particularly important at Bartram's Garden, and we cultivate a bean called the blue Shakamaxon bean, which is apparently a Lenape bean. The Lenape were the native peoples living in southeast Pennsylvania. True Love Seed sells that seed sometimes. If we grow enough, it's difficult for us to get a large crop, and it always sells out. But Ryan mentioned that for the Bartrams, we know less about what vegetables they were saving, what they were collecting of kitchen garden things, because their business is mostly about North American native plants. So they don't say much about it. And at one point, Bartram even says that he just doesn't have the time to deal with kitchen garden seeds and distributing them. But in 1785, William Bartram sent a large collection of agricultural seeds to the French government, and it included 8 bean varieties, English broad beans or Windsor beans, what we call fava beans in America, 3 kinds of black-eyed peas, lima beans, which he called Carolina or Cowie beans, which might have come from a Cherokee village. He had Chinese asparagus beans, which he claimed someone had found the seeds in a tea chest and sprouted them. And then, bush beans, 6-week bush beans, and common kidney beans. So beans were an important part of the diet, both in Pennsylvania and in Virginia.
And that's interesting. I just recently learned that, so this is a type of red noodle bean, and I guess that those were called asparagus beans in the 18th century. So that's pretty cool to hear. So what I have here, these are our pods, and whenever you can, it's great to have dried material. If you can't harvest it dry, then it's good to let it dry out before you try to do this step. And so if you have a small amount of seed, it's pretty easy to, break your pods by hand. You can kind of get your fingers used to that kind of work. And so that'll work really well. But if you have more seed, I recommend using a type of paper bag, any small paper bag. You'll put your seed in there, and this is a little bit wild, but it works really well. Kind of just work it a little bit.
I wish I'd had that the other day when I was doing some seed saving. That would have been amazing.
You can hear all of the seed in here. And I'll come back. Okay, and then you just can see how effectively that got all of that seed, and at least for this type, it's quite clean. So with this, I'll come in here. I'm going to sit down and do a quick. And that was actually a lot cleaner than it was when I practiced. So
you're cleaning the chaff, basically, Ryan, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you're blowing hard, gently?
No. Always start lightly. And that's what I did. Actually, this next seed we're going to do, hollyhock, is a little bit lighter weight. And so you got to definitely start with really low volume, or it will go everywhere.
And this is a seed that we got from Carlisle House in Alexandria, which is just about 10 miles away from us at Gunston Hall. They also have an 18th century garden and donated this seed to us for this program.
Yeah. All right. So we've got that, and then I'll kind of so we'll be sweeping here. And the nice thing, I guess, about this process is when you're working with some of these plants, you have so much seed that it is okay if you lose a little bit. And in fact, a lot of times the lighter seed isn't quite as resilient or viable as the seed that's heavier. And so while you may think, oh, I just blew away a lot of good stuff, I certainly did some, but I also blew away certain seeds that we might not want because they didn't fill out quite as well. Now, this is intended to kind of get us the basics. I certainly encourage you after this program to check out more seed saving resources, and Seed Savers Exchange is a fantastic resource for that. Lacey's going to throw that up, and I'm going to head back later on. We're going to put those seeds into packets. All right.
Ryan's heading back, and our next activity that we're going to be talking about is also very exciting. Ryan started with these plants that are self-pollinators. They're very well contained, and they don't cross very easily with other plants. This next one is a series of plants that very easily can cross with others. So we're going to talk about hand crossing, which is a modern technique, but in the 18th century, and you'll learn more about that in just a second, they were using techniques that helped prevent unwanted crossing between plants that could cross-pollinate by accident. So here are the supplies that you want for that activity. And in just a second, Ryan is going to get us started looking at what that activity looks like.
And maybe I'll just insert a little bit about John Bartram and
Sure.
pollen and his studies first. So let me just share my screen first.
Of course. I just want to give everybody just a second to make sure that if they've got the want the supplies, they've got them. And I will drop that screen in just a moment.
Yeah, John, this is going to be really exciting because they were doing a lot of crossing, weren't they?
Yeah, so let me start with just, oops, that's what I want to do. Information about John Bartram and pollen study. So early in his career, 1736 or 37, he begins studying pollen and plant structures based on the new Linnaean science, which had only been published in 1735. So we have a letter here from James Logan, who was a friend of Bartram's in Philadelphia. Last year, Peter Collinson sent me some tables, which I never examined until I last saw you. They digest all the productions of nature in classes, animal, vegetable, mineral. The performance is very curious and worthy of thy notice, but being in Latin, it will want some explanation. But we know very clearly Bartram read this, and this is the original 6 large folio sheets of Linnaeus' Systema Naturae. And part of that included looking at flower parts, pollen, what they called farina, which is pollen, and stamens or styles and pistils. Logan lends John Bartram a microscope, and on the left there you see some 18th century microscopes, early 18th century microscopes. We're not sure exactly what microscope Bartram had because none of them survived, but he had at least 4 different ones over time. So 1736, Logan is giving him instruction on microscopical observations. After returning from Virginia in 1739, John Bartram writes William Byrd that this spring I've made several microscopical observations upon the male and female parts in the vegetable world to oblige some ingenious botanist in Leiden. Leiden is in the Netherlands. Bartram's also collecting these press specimens, which also go to Europe. And this large volume you see in the photo on the left is at the British Museum. They were sent to Sir Hans Sloane, whose collections become the original British Museum. And then Bartram is also getting all these publications from Linnaeus, and Linnaeus' system is organized about counting stamens and pistils in flowers and organizing into 24 classes based on that. So anyway, this idea of both examining pollen and flower parts and then also physically moving bits of them back and forth becomes an important part of botanic science in this period. And I'll include more about this later, but maybe I'll switch over to Ryan now. You're muted.
Yeah, I was. So I'm going to share screen here and we'll talk a little bit more about doing a cross. Let's see if it's ready. Oh, I got to click that. So this is the idea here. So we have outcrossing varieties. Okra and squash are common. And when I say squash, this is a pretty big group. So all of those that you'd think of, but even melons, pumpkins, those all work quite similarly. And so this process would be very fine for that. Now, when you start thinking about doing hand crossing or pollinating in this way, you're kind of seed saving 2.0. You're thinking about how you're caring for that population of plants, because if you don't kind of think in that way, you might get your plants that don't come true, i.e. the seeds don't match what they grew from, or they might become inbred over time and thus become less viable. And so what we're going to do historically is look at cabbage and squash, but and that's kind of where we get this inspiration for looking at the squash. You can see in this image actually right here a pollinator, and so that's part of the issue that we're trying to mitigate. And in the 18th century, this issue was solved by spacing. And so we see here that they're saying, first off, that you should reserve the largest heads of the first crop. And this is talking about cabbage right now. And make sure that no other sort are permitted to feed seed near them, the F's and S's in this time. The seeds will be as good as those procured from abroad, and the sort may be preserved for many, many years. So spacing, if you keep things far enough apart, gardeners knew that they could keep their varieties the same. And like it shows here, that might be for outcrossing varieties 800 feet or up to a mile, depending on the crop that you're working with. They weren't perfect at it. This English gardener here was unable to be successful even if he had things grown at considerable distance. He cultivated the same sorts for 40 years, and he wasn't able to preserve the variety of pumpkin for more than 2 or 3 years. And pumpkin, that's one of those where the insects will travel quite great distances, 800 feet, to get to the next pollen source. And to kind of put this into context, the garden at Gunston Hall is about 1 acre. And thinking about 800 feet, we're about 600 feet long. And so we don't have the distance necessary. So we'd have to find another way to isolate our garden crops. Now, thinking about this, when you're selecting for isolation, we're going to be trying to find a flower that's just right. And this one here is an ideal one. It hasn't opened yet, so it can't have any foreign pollen. This one's a little bit old, and this one you'd probably have to wait a couple days. So this is the sort that we're looking at, and I have a couple more examples I'll show in just a second. So it's timing, and it's also that you need to find a male flower and a female flower because squash are kind of tricky. They have the male parts and the female parts in different places on the plant. And you can tell the male flowers, they usually elongate a little bit more. The female flowers often show the fruit underneath, and they don't typically come as far out from the stem. So the steps of this process are somewhat straightforward. You're going to close your male and female flowers, and I typically like to label them. So you can see here, this one's been labeled. I hadn't closed this one yet, but I would if I were using it. And then you can close them with the clothespin. Tape works well. And then again, labeling is good so you can find where you did this work and benefit from it. Because sometimes, you know, squash just go monster and you can't quite find anything in them, and then you get lost. So I'm going to show you the, yeah.
You also mentioned, I believe in the supplies list, a safety pin. How would you use a safety pin to close the end of the flower?
Oh, shoot. I think I meant clothespin. Yeah, the pins are so similar in my mind, I guess.
No worries. So we're looking at the kind of clothespin that's on the screen rather than a safety pin that's listed in the supplies list. I'll get that updated after the program ends.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. But other ways might be tape. You can tape them shut. You can also take brown bags and kind of close them around the stem. So there are other strategies, just as long as they are closed off. So to kind of review, I have here some samples from our garden. And let me see here. Okay, so this one has been opened a couple times. It would not be a good candidate. This one's just a little bit late. So if I had gotten it last night, it might have worked. Whereas this one, pretty spot on. And this is the one I'll work with. You can see that this one is maybe a day or two out. So it does take practice. You kind of have to work with your plants and observe them carefully over time. But taking the male flower, you're just going to open it and work your way around, exposing that pollen. Okay, and so this is what you would use to fertilize the female flower with. And then when you're doing that, you'll just open that female flower back up, and then this will spread the pollen in, and you'll be in great shape. You'll close the flower back up so that other cross-pollination cannot occur. And then you'll be done. You'll just watch that, let it grow out, and you're going to let it get about as big as it can, and harvest it much later than you normally would, so that those seeds can finish growing. Now, what's really fascinating about this whole process is that folks were actually pretty good at managing some of these Yeah.
Ryan, can we pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions about that
certainly.
last series of steps?
I'm just getting excited and keeping going here. So.
Oh, I know, it's amazing. This has been such a learning experience for me. So this is an appropriate time if anybody wishes to shout their question out loud. You can unmute yourself and let us know, or as always, you can type them into the chat and we'll read them out loud. I am excited about this next section though, especially with George Mason's involvement in this and the seed that he's buying. It's mind-boggling sometimes. All right, well, we'll continue on. As a reminder, you're welcome at any time to chat. Type your chat, words, I have them. Type your questions into the chat and we'll read them out. Ryan's gonna continue chatting about our cabbage, which is very exciting.
Yeah, a little bit of a deep dive for cabbage here. But this is one of the documented crops we have for George Mason. And here he's talking about how he lost them all, implying that he was engaged in saving seed, and they were managing that process actively. And down here is very fascinating, by the way, because 2 or 3 ounces of that type of seed is about 6,000 seeds. So it's kind of a crazy amount. Certainly, people are engaged in trading and sharing that seed, both formally via letters in this way and informally through personal networks. Now, he also orders seed, and this he orders from France, among other things, 2 ounces, so 4,000, somewhere in there. Again, a lot of cauliflower seed, and that is the 18th century spelling. So a lot of fun to see that.
One of many, actually. We saw earlier C-O-L-L-Y.
We will be seeing another one, actually, I think, here. But so George Mason at Gunston Hall was growing that for sure. And that we know this because we actually found cabbage type seed in these 2 beds that we were able to successfully do archaeology in. And that's been really hard at this site because a lot of the former owners sort of disrupted the area. And there were actually only these 2 beds where we could go and dig and find seeds to the 1780s, that time period. Now, just to give you a quick comparison, I thought this was kind of interesting. And it shows that we're kind of stuck because these seeds look identical to any seed in the cabbage family. And that kind of underscores the fact that these plants could all actively cross and produce viable seed, but maybe not what you wanted. They wouldn't do quite what you wanted. And at this time period, there were so many different types. This shows us well, and the ones we're familiar with, but even the multiple different kinds of each type. So these represent some of the varieties that folks were managing. And Jefferson is certainly an outlier, like he's really into this, and so he certainly has a lot. But looking at some of these other opportunities shows us that being able to handle seeds in a really smart way was pretty widespread across the community. And just to give you guys a little bit of context, I'm gonna go back really fast because I wanted to show that, those numbers for outcrossing varieties are pretty similar to ones for easy to save seeds like peas and beans. And so all of these high numbers of species for easy seeds, but also for really hard to manage crops and seeds like squash. So I think that's tremendous. And what's interesting too is to note that this is sort of the tip of the iceberg. If we know what we have really well documented, men like George Mason, Thomas Jefferson are saving these types of seeds. We know that they're tenant farmers, and the enslaved peoples were also managing them. Maybe not quite to this level. Maybe they had a type of cabbage and a type of broccoli, but they were certainly aware of what needed to happen to ensure that these things didn't cross. Similarly with melons, another great example of the varieties that are sustained. And then the last big idea that I have from this sort of deep dive is that they don't talk about population size. So in the herbals I was talking about and looking at, they don't really get into how many plants you should be growing or saving seed from that will create, you know, the inbred vegetable plants that you don't want. We know today that some of those numbers are listed below. And I kind of take that to point out that these gardens people were keeping were quite substantial, and that gardening was this just almost universal activity with seed saving tied up right into that. So now, you're muted, Lacey, but I think it's time we talk a little bit about how seeds were stored and packaged and sent in the 18th century.
Before we get there, we've got a couple of questions.
Awesome.
Firstly, did I miss it? Did you mention how many seeds are in the ounces of seed that George Mason wanted to purchase?
Yeah, so that's about 6,000.
So many. This is a huge number of seeds.
I mean, in our packets today, we maybe get 100 if we're lucky.
So associated with that is how long are seeds viable? So if Mason's ordering his set, would they be viable from the time it took them to ship from Europe back to the US? And a question we have in the chat is, are those archaeological seeds that we found still viable today?
Oh, unfortunately, I would not bet on that one. I think under good storage conditions, cabbage family, you get a couple of years, maybe more. But then you start to see your germination rates really decline. They keep several years pretty good up in the 80s, but after that, it can start to just, I don't think we get any luck with these. They were already in the ground, so I guess they had their shot, you know.
Makes sense.
They're probably only the shell is what's preserved anyway. The interior probably rotted away long ago.
Yeah, which
Makes
is
sense.
just crazy to think about.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I gotta bring this down. All right.
So our next activity, Joel is going to introduce to us, because the seed packets that we're talking about were actually found at a local site, not at Bartram's garden, right, Joel? At a
but nearby. Yeah. And so I'll show you some images. I'll start sharing that as the introduction. Okay. Here we go. So these were found at the House of the Woodlands. William Hamilton was a third generation wealthy Philadelphian who had a really big garden in West Philadelphia, roughly where the University of Pennsylvania is now located, if any of you know that, 40th and Woodland in Philadelphia. It's only about 2 miles north of Bartram's garden on a direct road. And actually William Bartram, the second generation Bartram, and William Hamilton were schoolmates for a period of about 4 years in the 1750s. So they knew each other quite well, and they continued a friendship with their gardens being very close by until Hamilton's death in 1815. Hamilton had he owned about 600 acres, a very large estate, but the garden itself was probably 50 or 60 acres. It included a wooded park, a very large landscape garden, a very large kitchen garden, and a greenhouse that was about 140 feet long with descriptions of 10,000 plants in pots, maybe 8,000 species of plants in the greenhouse, an amazing collection of plants. Anyway, about 20 years ago, in the attic of the surviving mansion, the Woodlands, an architectural historian, Tim Long, found these dusty, dirty, soot-ridden paper packets, and fortunately recognized they were valuable and saved them. There were maybe 300 to 400 have been uncovered there. They're between maybe 4 inches and 8 inches long, folded out of paper in an origami fashion, which you'll see demonstrated by Lacey in just a few moments. Many of them are labeled by William Hamilton. So this one, the first one you see here, says hibiscus. Hibiscus hastatus Michaud. That's William Hamilton's handwriting. And Hamilton often gives an authority name, which is the way botanists do now. You'll see a lot of vegetable names with Linnaeus or Bartram or someone else. In this particular case, Hibiscus hastatus Michaud, it doesn't go by that name now. It's now called Hibiscus leavis. It's the halberd leaf mallow or halberd leaf rose mallow. That's a plant we grow now at Bartram's Garden. I actually brought seed back from near Mobile, Alabama in the Tensas River Delta, but it probably wasn't really native as far north as Philadelphia in the 18th century. And this label mentioning Michaud could mean that William Hamilton received seed of this plant from the French botanist André Michaud, who we know was frequently at the Woodlands and also at Bartram's Garden in the 1780s and early 90s. And thing about these packets is they're being folded and saved by Hamilton. So Hamilton is saving vegetables and ornamental flower crops from his own garden, and they probably once were in boxes. Maybe this is where Hamilton was storing his collection of seeds. Maybe after his death, they were just dumped there and people didn't want to throw them away. But what had happened is rodents had gotten into the collection of seeds and pulled the paper packets under the floorboards and nibbled on them to eat whatever was valuable to eat. So almost all these, you'll see a little gnaw mark here. This one's in very good shape. Some of them are only fragments. Some of them have specific Bartram connections. So this one has Hamilton's label, Hydrangea quercifolia, Bartram's Travels. So he particularly says this plant came from William Bartram's Travels. Well, that plant is illustrated in the 1791 book, Bartram's Travels, as oak leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea quercifolia, oak leaf hydrangea. We think these paper packets of the Woodlands all date between 1800 and maybe 1807. So this is the earliest actual cultivation evidence for a shrub, which is now really common. A lot of people now know oak leaf hydrangea. It's been really widely planted in the last 25 years or so, from Boston all the way down to Charleston or maybe even into Florida. A very strikingly beautiful big hydrangea. And this summer was a particularly good year for hydrangeas. If you noticed it, I think I saw better hydrangea flowers of all types than ever this past summer. Another one is a hydrangea. This one has Hamilton's label, Hydrangea mutabilis. And you can see there's a big missing void, but we can piece together what Hamilton was saying. A most beautiful flowering shrub from China is what he wrote on this. Well, we happen to have a letter from 1800 where William Bartram is writing to another botanist in Philadelphia, Benjamin Smith Barton, and he says, "Have you seen the most beautiful hydrangea from China? The celestial blue of the flowers is inexpressibly pleasing." Well, this plant is the really common blue hydrangea, which is in almost every suburb and city and home garden in America and around the globe. Probably originally native to Japan, but these seeds or plants that Hamilton got probably came via London and maybe came from China. This hydrangea is often called the French hydrangea, the Hortensia. Hydrangea macrophylla is its current name. And on the left, this is the first illustration of it in Europe, 1799, Curtis's Botanic magazine. So the fact that it's in Philadelphia the next summer flowering means Hamilton was keeping up with all the latest botanic discoveries and fads. So I think that's the last packet I have, and I'll turn it over to Lacey, who will show you how to fold these packets.
Joel, we have a question in the chat about whether or not Bartram and Hamilton and any of these other people that we're chatting about are in direct contact with Carl Linnaeus.
So of them all, Bartram is the only one, and at the present, I think there are only 4 letters between Linnaeus and Bartram that survive. From 18th century Philadelphia, it was very difficult to get a letter to Sweden because there wasn't generally direct trade with that part of Northern Europe. Ships, and there also were navigation laws which allegedly forbade colonial intercourse with anything but London and a few other special ports, maybe Portugal as well. things did travel different ways, and American ships would go to London, and then ships from there would go to Amsterdam, and from there they would go to Sweden. But from what we know, it could take 3 years or even 5 years to get a letter from Philadelphia to Sweden and get an answer back. So direct connection with Linnaeus is very difficult, but the Bartrams are getting Linnaean books from Amsterdam. So there is much more direct trade with Amsterdam and Leiden in the Netherlands. So I did a count once where John Bartram probably had a dozen different Linnaean publications. So he knows quite well what's happening. And very late in his career, 1767 or so, John Bartram is made a member of the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, and he sends a lot of material then. So there are about 300 plant specimens from John Bartram now in Stockholm in what's called the Bergius Herbarium, and in Philadelphia, his certificate in that organization survives in the Historical Society. So yeah, but everyone else is pretty much we've been talking about our post-Linnaeus, because Linnaeus dies 1770 or 1777, I think.
Yeah, and Linnaeus is, by the third quarter of the 18th century, Linnaeus's books are fairly widely spread. They've made
yes, but widely in an academic upper class
Correct.
sense.
Correct.
I would say probably like 1 or 2 copies in every major city. So
Right.
that's the sort of widely spread.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
So I just want to mention for everybody who's joining us that we have hit that magic 11:30 mark, and we understand if you need to drop off and go do other things this morning. I am going to trade cameras and do our last activity for just a moment, but I do want to thank everybody who needs to pop off for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we hope you had a great time. So I'm going to put up a screen share of the supplies list for this last activity and take a moment to transition over to my other camera.
This is a really awesome seed packet for really small seeds, and it's just super cool how they were able to do it without using any staples, any fastening device. They just
even any measurement. You could just tear a functional size piece of paper out of a newspaper and fold them. And it's funny, this was common knowledge to almost everybody in the historic period, because when you went to a pharmacy or an apothecary, all the powdered drugs you got were folded up in the same kind of way. So probably 400 or 500 years, this was common knowledge. But everyone's forgotten it now because we get printed packets, and even the printed packets with fancy labels are fairly recent. Maybe the last 100, 120 years they've been available wide scale.
Yeah, it's crazy. I think that's the whole idea of seed saving, that practice very commonplace and not so much the same today.
Hey Ryan, could you kill the screen share for me?
Absolutely.
So we're back over here at our overhead cam, and we're going to be folding this seed packet that Joel showed us. I'm going to do my first one on origami paper because it's got the double color, so it's a little easier to see what I'm doing. And I'm going to fold a couple. So I'm totally game. If you have questions and you want to shout them out verbally, feel free to do so. Or you can also type them in the chat. Ryan, if you could help me out by reading those aloud, because it's a little hard to see them.
Yeah, I've got the chat up, so I will.
Perfect. Thank you. So we recommended that you start with a rectangle. These are square, and this piece of paper is about 4.5 inches long. So that's good for one side, but I'm going to take it down just a little bit on this other side to about 3 1/4 to make that nice little rectangle for us. So I'm going to use my ruler. For those of you who are not ruler lovers, you can be totally freeform and just cut away at will. But I like to have a guideline. All right, so there's my rectangle. I'm ready to get my my seed packet started. So I'm going to start with my green side up so that you can see the writing on it when I get to that point. The first step is to fold down the seam. You might have seen this on some of the packets that Joel showed. And Joel, you noted the other day that Hamilton, he liked to start writing his information up on the seam.
Yeah, and that seems unusual. A lot of the other packets from other locations I've seen, they write only on the big main body, but
Right
Hamilton
here.
always wrote, yeah, always wrote on that little flap. So it's kind of his own
Yeah.
personal whim to do that.
So I folded my little seam down, and then I made a second fold to pull it in so that it's half of what's left. So you can see my seam there. I'm going to fold that down on top, and now we're ready to start the sides. So I'm going to flip it over and put the seam on the side closest to me and pull the bottom corners, what's now the top on the screen, up towards me. So I've got this fun little trapezoid. Okay, and then we're going to unfold those back again. And these become guidelines for us to use in just a minute. I'm going to fold the tops back. And these are going to stay folded for this one. All right. And now you can see this is the side that Hamilton was writing his label up on the top. Most people are writing on the big body. And we're going to close up this end by tucking the point of the fold just underneath the top seam. And that creates a really nice tight anchor that will hold the seeds in. And this packet is ready to get a label and be loaded. So Ryan, I'm going to put these in there. That's the false indigo, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Australis baptista, I believe.
Which the Bartrams grew. They grew
Yeah, I was going to say.
Three colors of baptisia. Blue, the blue one they say they found on the Potomac, up at the headwaters of the Potomac.
Oh, nice.
In the mountains.
All right, so there we go. There's my false indigo, Australis baptisia. And I'm just going to open the side up and drop my seeds in. Yep, I'm making a mess. Need a funnel. There we go. All right, so we've got a nice full packet of that false indigo seed. This is actually might be just a hair too small for this much seed because it is really full. Not a lot of room for that to move around in there. And that one's ready to go. And I'm curious, you mentioned, Joel, that you think Hamilton might have been storing his packets in boxes.
Yeah.
And having that writing right up there on that top seam would have made it easier just to kind of flip through.
Actually, you're right. I hadn't ever thought of that. That's a good argument to make as to why he might have done that. Yeah. And there may have been,
when it's full.
I don't know what kind of boxes they would be. He could have. He was so wealthy. They may have been custom made, but you know, probably something the size of a shoebox. Maybe there were small wooden precious containers like that. And yeah, so some of the Hamilton ones were made on newspaper. You can see the print.
Yeah. So we're using a reprint of an 18th century newspaper, and those boxes that you were talking about, Joel, there were also custom made boxes called band boxes, and he could have ones that are custom. Could have had ones that were custom.
Oh, true.
Made
Yeah, the ones made paper. Yeah.
Yeah. I've made those, and they're actually really stable.
Yeah, the Bartrams in shipping things, they talk about seeds in paper packets, also in cloth bags, silk or cotton bags, but they also made small boxes, and they made paper bags. They talk about, which they probably couldn't buy. They probably just glued together paper on their own to make a bag.
Yep. Paper bags, the paper bag maker for the number 10 paper bag actually didn't come into being until the very end of the 19th century.
Oh, really?
And its inventor was a woman.
Ah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I can't remember her name off the top of my head. All right, so Ryan, what are these ones?
Those are the red noodle beans that we discussed, and we said they would be asparagus beans in this time period. I don't know really. I think they were starting to gain a following. I believe they're in Jefferson's farm book.
Oh, that makes sense.
Places.
Yeah, Jefferson.
Perhaps not widespread.
Yeah, Jefferson was very, very interested in keeping track of what he was growing. And you notice I made a much bigger packet for these because they are a much bigger seed. So I'm gonna pour some in there.
And that seems to be the way it was. You made a packet based on the size of your seeds, because I've seen them even 8 or 10 inches long, but I've seen them very small as well.
Ta-da! So there we've got a couple of packets. We've got our false indigo, our asparagus beans, and I'll make another one for some of our hollyhock seeds in just a couple of minutes. But I know we're a little over time, and I want to make sure that we let you all go and get on with the rest of your days. So I'm going to switch back to my other camera. If you have any other thoughts or questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll address them in just a second.
Well, I really appreciate, Joel, you taking time on a Saturday to share this great information with us. Thank you so much.
I'm happy that both you and Lacey invited me. This has been a lot of fun. I was at Gunston Hall maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but I haven't been there in a long time. So this is a nice, vicarious way of being there without even leaving my apartment.
We know the feeling, and it got really weird for us for a while there, but we're excited to be back part-time. And we're excited to be able to offer programs like this here at Gunston Hall. I want to say thank you to everyone again for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your Saturday morning. Ryan, Joel, and I will hang out for a few more minutes to answer questions, but I am going to let you know that this, as I mentioned earlier, this is our penultimate summer Saturday. Our last one is next Saturday, August 29th, again at 10:30 in the morning, and our last theme is games. We'll be trying to solve an 18th century game mystery and playing a couple of others that were not played probably by the Mason family. One of them was a really popular tavern game, and one of them was likely played by people who were enslaved here at Gunston Hall. So thank you again so much for joining us. We appreciate having you. Hope you had a great time today, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you so much.